God promised blessings and prosperity for the people in the land. And does this support the prosperity doctrine of today? What do you talk about the concept that you come to faith and God will prosper you? You will have no lack. And what do you have to say about it from the Old Testament perspective?
Okay, let me start from the dominion that man has lost in Genesis chapter 3. The impact of the fall of man on the earth was that the land would not yield its blessing to man. He has to work hard to earn his livelihood. That's why God said, by the sweat of your brow, you have to earn your livelihood. The land will be as hard as iron, as you see in the book of Leviticus, if you do not obey me and commit sin. God's promise of material blessing to his redeemed people. We are talking about the redeemed people. God's promise of material blessing to his redeemed people was in this context of alienation of the environment. The sin brought this alienation. The sin actually impacted the nature. God cursed the earth on account of man. And therefore, when God redeems, when God restores, this alienation is actually set right by God. And therefore, the blessing when man works on the land, now it is going to produce what the land is supposed to produce for his livelihood. The suffering and the pain because of his hardship, work. Now, the same work will be there. But the productivity of the land, God has blessed. And therefore, we have to look at this productivity and the blessing of this productivity in the context of the man's alienation from God and the curse of God on the earth. And what you are looking at now is the productivity and the satisfaction that God gives. If you look at Ecclesiastes, for example, in chapter 2, verse 24 onwards, the enjoyment of the produce is a gift of God. A sinful man cannot enjoy the produce. Even if you have a little things, there will be satisfaction if you are a redeemed person blessed of God. That's a blessing God is talking about. Not about greed. The Bible speaks against greed. And therefore, what the prosperity doctrine proponents speak about is this greed. So let me just give you, a little more on that. When you talk about God's promise was favorable, natural condition for their hard work. Rain in its season and the productivity of the land. If you don't obey God, God will shut the heavens. There won't be any rain. And therefore, even though you sow the seed, you have to depend upon God for its growth. God has to give you the rain. God has to let that produce. And therefore, the productivity is from God and it is a blessing of God. So this promise of God is opposite to those who live in alienation, for whom economic growth became an end in itself. That's a greed. Their focus is to get more and more and more. And the Bible never talks about it. The blessing of God is not in that sense, that you will get 10 houses, you will get 10 cars, and you will get every latest thing that you get. That's what the prosperity doctrines people would say as a measure to measure their blessing. But what you have to understand, the Bible never says that the material blessing is not a measure to measure God's blessing. So greed is different. The proponents of this doctrine, they are talking about the greed. They are not talking about the blessing. The blessing is misrepresented by them for their greed. The first fruit offering acknowledges God as the giver. That's the main thing. Moreover, the offerer has to make a confession when he brings this first fruit. If you look at Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 11 to 12, they have to make a confession. What is a confession? I was an alien. I was a wanderer. But God brought me into this land. And God is the one who has given me this blessing. So that is what he has to say when he brings this first fruit. Acknowledging God as a one who had brought him from his homeless condition, wandering, put him in this land, and provided him livelihood. We're talking about livelihood, so that he can live in peace and in prosperity. It is not greed. It is for his living with peace and satisfaction. I once again want to remind you about Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 24 to 26. It's a beautiful conclusion for the first part. It points out, the enjoyment of what you have is a gift from God. And those who are sinners, God will take from them and give it to those who believe in God and trust in God. And therefore, this is the blessing that we are talking about, not greed and not as the proponents of the prosperity people say.